Want to learn about public policy with a group of curious fellow learners? Apply for the 12-week graduate certificate in public policy. Early bird deadline closes 27th July.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. My name is Shobhankita and I'm a researcher with Takshashila's High-Tech Geopolitics program. In this episode, we will be talking about rare earth metals and magnets. These have come to the fore amid concerns about supply chain disruptions, especially since China recently imposed export controls on them. I'm joined by Dr. Julie Klinger in this episode to talk about rare earths. Julie is a professor of geography at the University of Delaware and is the author of Rare Earth Frontiers, From Terrestrial Subsoils to Lunar Landscapes. Julie, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
I'm also joined by my colleague Tannmay for this episode. Tannmay, good to have you here.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Awesome. Julie, my first query to you is about this misnomer, because rare earths are not really rare. They're quite abundant in the Earth's crust, and chemists have been lamenting about this misnomer all the way back in 1907. And yet, this is stuck, and it continues to influence our popular imagination. Why do you think this is stuck? What is the historical and geopolitical context here?
That's an excellent question. I mean, geologically speaking, rare earths are not rare at all, the vast majority of them at least. They're relatively ubiquitous in the Earth's crust. However, the geological conditions under which a mineable deposit of rare earths are likely to coalesce are also the same geological conditions that are amenable to the formation of uranium and thorium deposits as well. And so what's rare is not the elements themselves, but more finding a place or a jurisdiction that is willing to host rare earth mining and processing. And so that's more of a structural scarcity as opposed to an actual scarcity. Now, the term itself refers to 17 chemically similar elements, elements 57 to 71 in the periodic table. That's the lanthanide series plus scandium and yttrium. And I think the phrase rare earth sticks around for two reasons. One, it's exciting to call something rare, just like it's exciting to call something critical, right? Even though we have to ask, critical for what exactly? But we'll come back to that. And the other thing is that I think it is a useful shorthand, right? So when people are talking about rare earth elements, depending on the applications, they might only be talking about 3 or 4: neodymium, praseodymium, dysprosium, europium. And that's a little bit of a mouthful if you aren't an expert. So that's my theory for why the misnomer sticks around.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. So even recently when a US-Ukraine deal was being proposed, these quote-unquote critical minerals again came to the fore. And these minerals being such a significant part of the discussion was almost funny because a recent IEEE article says that there are actually no deposits of rare earth ore in Ukraine, at least that are known to be mineable in an economically viable way. In any case, no recent assessment of these reserves was conducted, and the current estimations were done when Ukraine was still a part of USSR, and that too using old exploration methods. So one has to really ask, what is going on here?
It's interesting, right? We're all in a situation where we're trying to make sense of what's happening. And there's a lot of activity around so-called critical raw materials within this context. And so with respect to Ukraine, one of the things that's been very striking to me is actually the imprecision of terminology. It's not always clear what people are referring to. Because you'll read a news story in a credible publication and they'll use the phrase rare metals, but then they'll talk about, say, lithium for example, which is not part of the rare earth family. And the other thing, too, is that the areas of Ukraine currently under Russian occupation, that area is rich in hydrocarbons, right? So oil and gas and coal. And depending on which country and which list you're looking at, those might also be considered critical raw materials, right? Because whether or not something is critical really comes down to where the entity putting together that list sits in the global supply chain, right? So if the supply is vulnerable to disruption, it's more likely to be designated as critical. The other thing that I think is happening here, and I've seen this throughout my research, looking at the global geography of rare earth mining and processing, including a little over a decade ago, the way in which rare earth elements figured quite significantly in efforts to or deregulate the moon and outer space and open it up for mining. And that's that. I think that they actually serve as an interesting pretext to organize and coordinate a whole host of longer term activities that have to do with extending a very particular set of generally Western business interests, right, in places that have historically served as raw material exporters. Right. And so the thing that concerns me here from a development standpoint is that all of this activity around critical minerals and critical raw materials is actually serving to reinscribe a kind of global division of labor. Right. Not just between global North and global South, but as I'm seeing in my own country and in North America and in parts of the EU, kind of reinscribing that division of labor between, centers and peripheralized spaces.
A quick follow-up on this, right? So whenever we talk about rare earth elements and rare earth metals and magnets, we see a lot of rhetoric, especially from political leaders, when it comes to, ensuring access to maybe reserves. And that's why maybe we've seen maybe political leaders in North America, like Trump, come up and say Greenland is crucial to us because we have various rare earth element deposits that we want, despite the fact that like you said, rare earth elements are not actually rare geologically, right? So maybe a little bit on, maybe if I could pick your brain about, do you think rare earth elements in that sense are used as a political bargaining card? If they're used as a tool to maybe further other political interests, and if you think they're actually rare in that sense, if the US actually needs maybe deposits of certain rare earth elements, a little bit on that.
Yeah, that's a good question. And with all of these events around Ukraine, around Greenland, et cetera, I and other experts, we've had to be very careful to avoid engaging in the sense-making work when, in fact, there may not be a profound strategy there, at least not coming from the White House. No doubt other opportunistic actors are identifying opportunities, right? Actually, let me say, with respect to the excitement around Greenland as well as Ukraine and other kind of international efforts to identify rare earth elements, is that, in fact, not only are rare earth elements not rare, but they're used in comparatively small quantities. And so this means that actually the rare earth market is pretty tough. And in the context of the United States, a number of companies have been working very hard to try and make a business model around building a mine-to-magnet supply chain within the US. And this has proven difficult and elusive, and it's required a lot of supportive investment, both public and private, because, in fact, the global supply is not that constrained. And so from a business or even a national interest standpoint on the part of the United States, aggressively working to open up new sources of rare earth elements in places like Greenland or Ukraine would directly undercut not only U.S. business interests operating within the continental United States, but also the substantial public and private investment, right, in attempting to bring those facilities online within North America. And so this leads me then to speculate that, maybe they're simply exciting and they serve as a pretext to be expansionist, right? Because part of what's happening right now between different political blocs globally is a scramble to lock down resources and set up bilateral agreements and all of these sorts of things. It's not actually about creating a rational supply chain. The other, and I think considerably more worrying aspect of this, goes back to the geological character of many rare earth deposits themselves, which is that they tend to co-occur with uranium and thorium. And so I have to wonder if all of this excitement around rare earth elements is not actually about the radioactive materials that have weapons applications, right? As we know, rare earth elements do as well.
Got it. So the nature of this industry right now is such that incumbents, especially the larger they are, the more advantage they have in their operations. Given that rare earths are needed in super small quantities, and the cost structures of this industry are so inimical to new entrants, China's dominance in this industry is quite significant then. So over the past 30 years or so, deindustrialization in the West has coincided with movement of supply chains to China, and China's manufacturing prowess, industrial policy, cheap labor, lax environmental regulations have played a very important role in this. Let's not forget mining is very, very polluting. So the lax environmental regulations really help. And I don't want to undercut China's capability here. They've also invested tremendously in R&D, technical know-how, consistently for decades. But China's dominance in this industry now, and especially its willingness to exploit this dominance as a strategic lever, is concerning, given how difficult it is for smaller, newer entrants to come up to speed in this industry. What's going on here? And Julie, if you could maybe elaborate on the possibility of diversifying away from China today.
Yeah, there's some really interesting things that have been happening here. The first is, as you mentioned earlier, the restrictions on magnets was the first time that export restriction was explicitly called a retaliatory measure. And so what I see here is different heads of state are deciding to play the game according to the mode that the Trump White House is using, which tends to be do something really extreme, shocking, and that goes against the norms, and then negotiate from there. Right. So we've seen this in multiple situations. And I think China and the rare earth magnet exports are simply an example of that. Right. With respect to China's dominance over the rare earth supply chain, there are a couple of important points that I'd like to share with you and your listeners. So the first is that China historically, over the end of the 20th century and well into the beginning of the 21st century, they mined and produced up to 97% of the rare earth elements that were consumed globally. About half of those rare earth elements that were mined were consumed by value-added industries in China, right, during this period. And what China's strategy has been for about a decade and a half has been to move itself up the value-added supply chain, right? So to move away from primary mining and to really consolidate expertise in value-added processing for a whole host of applications. And so in 2018, China succeeded at this. 2018 was the first year that China imported more rare earth elements, right? Raw material than they exported. And so that is a very important point to understand, right? China's dominance is not necessarily in mining anymore, like from a global supply chain perspective, right? Their strengths are really in the value-added processing. And so what that means then is that diversifying the global supply chain, opening new mines elsewhere, it's significant in two ways. One, it does actually align with China's own domestic industrial strategy to source raw materials from elsewhere instead of mining them within China. But two, if those mines are opened without also building up the value-added processing outside of China, it simply means that the dynamic will continue, right? So whether mines are opening in North America or Greenland or Ukraine or Namibia or Mozambique or India or Vietnam or Kazakhstan, without the value-added supply chain also to accompany those new mines, that material gets sent to China for processing. right? And then China exports the value-added components, such as rare earth magnets and other rare earth-bearing technologies.
Quick follow-up on this. So why has China been able to build such a dominance when it comes to value-added refining and, value-added processing? Why is it so that no other international competitor has been able to, comprehensively challenge China's dominance in refining in particular over the last 5 years? And why is China still able to, consolidate this dominance? Is it just economic reasons? Is the Chinese government, helping these refining firms, or is it maybe some new technology that they've developed when it comes to refining? And so why have they built it? And is it possible? So then what are the diversification strategies when it comes to refining, right? How can maybe foreign firms come to refining? Is it just maybe an investment problem that when it comes abroad, or maybe governments and companies just not interested and just not as much interested when it comes to refining? So if you could just, explain the dominance when it comes to refining and what can we do to break it, that would be a great.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. If anything, China's strengths in the rare earth sector demonstrate what is possible with substantial investment in research and development and a long-term stable industrial policy. Right. And so one takeaway from that is, certainly it's possible, but it depends on a commitment of resources and a supportive policy environment and all of this. And also a willingness to make dramatic changes in a domestic industrial strategy when, the time is right. And an example of that would be, one of the measures that China's central government took in order to, move the country's rare earth industrial platform up the supply chain was the forced closure and consolidation of a whole host of small-scale mining operations, right? So people lost out in that, right? Some of those entities have been able to go overseas, right, through the Belt and Road Initiative and set up operations elsewhere. But it's a kind of decisiveness when it comes to industrial policy and planning that is essential in a complex industry like this. The other part of it, too, is that for multiple reasons, not least of which has been, the fact that the environmental and social costs have not been included in the price of rare earth elements that China has produced, is that downstream firms all over the world have for the longest time, and for the most part, continue to be largely unwilling to pay a premium for rare earth-bearing technologies that are produced outside of China. A case in point, I'll give you an example from the US. The strategy for downstream firms in the US in supporting nascent efforts, or ongoing efforts, I would say, they're no longer nascent, to build a mine-to-magnet supply chain in the US. They're about adding redundancy to their supply chain, right? That's quite different from aiming to shift a supply chain, to totally shift the geography of the supply chain outside of China. And so what this means is actually on a day-to-day level, firms located in China, whether they're Chinese firms or joint ventures or international firms operating in China, they have been reliable trade partners, right? And so from a business standpoint, there's considerable risk and additional cost involved in deciding to set up a large-scale, long-term purchasing agreement with a new and largely unproven firm outside of China.
Got it. I want to come to the export controls, basically licensing requirement, export restrictions on rare earth metals and magnets that China has been imposing. And there is precedent here. There is history here, not a direct parallel. So the internet, and particularly the English language search, will tell you that in 2010, China had embargoed the exports of rare earth metals to Japan. But in your research, you point out that this is not true. What happened then was actually individual bureaucrats and military personnel acting out of their own personal agency. And this was not really an action of the state, which is different from today, because today China has officially stated these export controls and set up systems to implement them. Regardless, are there any lessons from the 2010 experience for people watching today?
Yeah, excellent. So the context for the 2010 export restrictions was actually, a geopolitical conflict between China and Japan that didn't have anything to do with rare earth elements, right? It was, according to my research, it had to do with an ongoing territorial dispute over the Diaoyu or Senkaku Islands, depending on which map you look at. They're labeled differently, and this conflict escalated, right? And the story goes is that a Chinese fisherman decided to approach those islands, taking matters into his own hands. And the Japanese Coast Guard, which was patrolling the island at the time, by the way, the Coast Guards of both countries take turns doing routine patrols of the islands just to make sure that no one conquers them, right? They issued several warnings for him to leave the area, and instead of complying, he rammed his fishing vessel into a Japanese Coast Guard vessel and was taken into custody. And so this was absolute scandal within China, and on China's eastern seaboard, it was, of course, interpreted according to longer-term grievances going all the way back to World War II. And so people were really impatient with how long it was taking Beijing to secure the release of this fisherman. And so military officials and port workers in a couple of ports on China's eastern seaboard decided to, now we would call it maybe malicious compliance, right? To subject outbound vessels for Japan to very thorough inspections, right? And to hold up shipments. And it just so happened that several of these vessels in question were transporting rare earth elements, right? And so it is true, right, that there was a temporary suspension of exports from a handful of firms or from a handful of ports from China. Subsequent trade data has also showed that a number of ports within Japan did also continue to receive or even received increased volume of rare earth elements during this time. And the other thing that's, I think, interesting and instructive from this is that even though it was not an embargo, strictly speaking, right, an embargo is an official halt of exports. And this was anything but. The headline that broke in the English language media was that China embargoed rare earth elements to Japan. And so people woke up to this headline. They had to learn very quickly what rare earth elements are, realize that they were important for everything, realize that China produced 97% of them. I think around the time the whole, Avatar had been the highest grossing film of all time, right? So there's a little bit of cultural priming of the imagination. And markets reacted, right? Prices increased for certain commodities by about 2,000% or thereabouts. This time around, with the lesson of hindsight, Western firms, market and financial interests have recognized the export restrictions for what they are, which is a gift to industry outside of China, right? One of the reasons it's been so difficult to diversify supply chains outside of China is simply it hasn't been economically feasible. And the public and private investment has been, in most cases, not enough. There are a couple of notable exceptions, of course. And so, whereas the price increases in 2010 for a time created this new landscape of opportunity globally, but really wasn't appreciated at the time, right? I don't think. This time around, business interests are quite explicit about how export restrictions are actually good for some or certain actors or interests outside of China. And that to me is a really interesting turn of events because it raises questions around, okay, what are the actual interests at play here in these trade disputes? Within the rare earth supply chain itself, there are winners and losers at any given time. When materials are flowing smoothly, the losers are, the folks kind of earlier on in the supply chain. When materials are restricted, the losers are the folks further down the supply chain who are relying on buying finished goods. Right?
Since we've started talking about the current export controls, maybe if we could hear from you a little bit on the current 6-month pause that's been instituted by a deal between China and the US. So how will this impact, like you said, an opportunity for diversification to happen outside of China, for industry to flourish outside of China? So that is something everyone was looking forward to with the export controls being instituted by China. But where does the pause end us with? Like, where are we now with the pause? Do you think the pause will? Where do you see us after 6 months, essentially?
Yeah, it's very difficult to predict right now. How long the pause will last, or even if it's appropriate to call it a pause, if it simply, becomes the new normal, which is to say, return more or less to the status quo. What it does indicate, though, and I think by some accounts, this was also a really key element in Beijing intervening in 2010 to resume exports to Japan, is that different segments of the supply chain, business interests, demand that national leaders do something differently, right? In the case of the U.S., right, it was automakers, right, who seem in this case to have a really strong voice to call for resumption of exports from China to U.S. automakers. In 2010, by some accounts, and this is not my own independent research, but accounts from folks whose perspective I do trust, is that ultimately Beijing intervened. What the account goes, Beijing intervened to resume exports in 2010 because of the circular flow of rare earth supply chains. And by that, I'm referring to, the refined material was exported to Japan, used to produce advanced technological components, which were then exported from Japan and imported into China for technology assembly, right? And disrupting those exports to Japan actually disrupted the imports back to China. And you had these factories that were idle and workers who weren't getting paid. And that's a real problem, right? And so I think both of those examples kind of illustrate the kind of complex political game that national leaders have to play when they're playing around with trade restrictions.
Yeah, so Beijing's chokehold in this industry, and specifically the permanence it's instituted to the bureaucratic structures of this export control, like Tannmay was asking, do you think there may now be scope and incentive for investments by private players across the value chain? So in processing know-how, recycling, reclamation, investments to open up and expedite the opening up of new mines? Or do you think this temporary relief for 6 months will make this the new status quo, essentially kicking down the extension from 6 months to longer and longer, and China will continue to remain dominant? Is the situation right now so uncertain that there is really no incentive yet for any upfront investments by private players?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think, with serious, stable, long-term investment, I think that this situation, if anything, kind of precipitates an opportunity for public and private entities across the world to invest in different parts of the rare earth supply chain. It really does come down to creating a stable investment and industrial development environment. That is something that this current situation that we're in, where this is a pause, maybe, is fundamentally hostile to, right? So if the rest of the world is just waiting to see how things are going to play out, well, then, the status quo does have a lot of inertia. And there are a lot of very deep, transnationally linked business interests that, really, really are vested in the status quo, right? So without a very substantial investment in reorganizing the supply chain, kind of irrespective of market conditions, I think it's difficult to expect that this will, fundamentally transform things in a way that departs from current trends.
Right. So around 2010, more than 97% of all global production came from China. And when prices sufficiently increased, even for a short period of time, that number reduced to something in the 80s%. This was, of course, coupled with this perception of a rising China threat. So it was markets reacting, prices rising, a a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction from everybody, as well as this perception of China as a threat, and especially because China was growing really, really fast at the time. So I want to ask you where we are today in finding substitutes to some of these rare earths. Given that their importance in green energy transition, there has been renewed interest in them. A lot of funding, honestly, has gone into climate technology recently. So where are we on the substitution front at this point?
I would say that that the quest for substitution has been ongoing, right? This is so if you work in chemistry or material science or chemical engineering, depending on the context in which you're working, researchers and research groups are often playing around with the periodic table to see if this can do this, or if that can do this, or if you combine these things in this way, does it allow you to do something else, right? And so with respect to substitutability for rare earth elements, there have been a couple of pretty substantial innovations. I mean, this is kind of reaching back to several years ago now, but the development of phosphors that didn't require rare earth elements was a major sea change in what was thought to be, for LEDs and LEPs, what was thought to be, a pathway of skyrocketing demand, right, as the world moved toward more energy efficient lighting systems. Turned out you can make those energy efficient lighting systems with little to no rare earth elements, right, compared to, of course, depending on the technology and compared to previous modes as well. With respect to other forms of substitution, we do have to. I think this does prompt some larger questions around the technologically intensive applications where you find rare earth elements, for example. So for example, in my phone, there are some apps that have a kind of haptic feature, right? Or the phone will buzz or vibrate or what have you. Depending on the phone, that may or may not involve rare earth elements, right? And we can ask ourselves, is that buzzing at that intensity strictly necessary, right? And that's, of course, a trivial kind of example, but there are a number of other examples, say, in EVs, right? Rare earth elements are important for the energy efficiency components of EVs as well, but they're also found in a whole host of other kind of fancy, flashy, glittery technological applications, so that, a private passenger vehicle is essentially, maybe up to a multi-ton computer on wheels. Right? We have to ask ourselves, is that level of computerization strictly necessary, particularly when it then makes things very difficult to repair when things go awry, right? But the other, and I think much more profound discussion around substitutability, shifts in demand, and all of this is that, yes, while it is true that rare earth elements are important for renewable energy technologies, for EVs, for wind turbines, and all of this, the truth is they're important for every energy system, right? They're crucial for oil and gas refining. They're used in the hardware and advanced technologies of nuclear power plants. And they're also used in the superalloys in water turbines for large-scale hydro, right? And so the important thing, I think, to keep in mind here is that, abandoning renewable energy goals is not going to make these supply chain issues go away. Even more so when we consider, what's often referred to as the dual use of rare earth elements, right? They have, many of the rare earth elements have many applications in weapons technologies. And we're in a period of breathtaking, record-breaking increases in military spending around the world. All of that does have supply chain implications, right?
And how do you think the global demand for these rare earths will be the next few years? So, except for the second half of the 20th century, when the demand exploded, primarily because we figured out various applications that they were useful in. We also figured out how to separate, process rare earths at scale. But apart from that, the demand has been otherwise quite linear, but of course on a small base. Do you think this will change going forward?
Before you answer that, if I can just add a little follow up on that question, would it be helpful to divide rare earth elements and maybe classify a few as which maybe would have increased demand in the coming years, which are particularly critical to the technology that we are developing with rare earth elements as compared to the rest. Because I feel like with a few of the lesser used rare earth elements, they often, like you said at the start, get unnecessarily clubbed into this group. And if you could maybe even give us that distinction, which rare earth elements maybe we should keep an eye out for increasing demand, something along those lines as well.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah. So because I'm in a sector that tends to take the longer view, right? In research and academia, we look at longer term trends and primarily, although of course we're attentive to current events as they unfold. I think just as we've been seeing gradually over the past 15 years, a decline in the total share of rare earth elements that China is producing, right, from 97% at its peak down to somewhere in the low 80%, high 70s, depending on the statistics that you look at. Over the past 15 or so years, we have also seen a fairly steady but modest increase in demand, right, for rare earth elements. Now, of course, projections, depending on the projections that you look at, depending on which sector you're looking at, most of the graphs go up and to the right. I think, though, that it is safe to say that we can expect demand to continue to increase. I don't feel like it's possible to predict at what rate. Simply because when we do have these moments of technological innovation where, technology or technological component turns out it doesn't need a particular rare earth element to perform its function and perform it well, that creates a momentary dip. But then other applications, other uses, tend to be found for rare earth elements, in part because the material is already being produced. Right, so it's here, it's available, and people figure out what to do with it. And I do think also that some precision in terminology, specifically, Tannmay, to your question around specifying the elements that are used, I think that might help improve the discourse, certainly. Now, already with critical minerals, critical raw material lists, this element by element specificity is already there, right? On the USGS's critical minerals list, only certain rare earth elements are actually specified, right? And those tend to be, the ones that are really important for magnets and batteries. So neodymium, samarium, dysprosium is also included because of its defense and superalloy applications, and praseodymium as well. And so really specifying what we mean and which applications we're talking about as critical, I think, might be a good next step in our public debate.
And is there a distinction here between the light rare earth elements and the heavy rare earth elements? Looks like the heavier ones are harder to separate as compared to the lighter ones. So is there a difference between the applications that the two groupings are possibly useful for?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So particularly when an exciting new deposit or development is announced, it will often talk about, the content of heavy rare earth elements versus light rare earth elements. And so just very, very simply, light refers to the elements that have smaller atomic numbers, and heavy are essentially the second half of the lanthanide series. And there are a couple of things that make the heavy rare earth elements a bit more expensive and valuable compared to the light rare earth elements. Right. The first thing comes right back down to basic geology. Contrary to the way some things might be represented in the press sometimes, every rare earth deposit has both heavies and lights. Right. The tricky bit, the thing that makes the heavies more expensive, is that when you're refining and separating rare earth elements, you have to refine and separate out the light rare earth elements first, right? You kind of proceed sequentially up the periodic table of elements as you're refining materials. And so that means if you have a relatively higher proportion of lighter rare earth elements, you're going to have to invest more in refining and separating before you can get to the heavies. And that makes the heavies more expensive, right? The other aspect too, then, is that because lighter rare earth elements are more available, you refine them first. They tend to then be cheaper, right? Which means that they're not as valuable. That producers don't get as good of a price for them. But also that does mean that their applications are relatively more numerous than heavy rare earth elements. And so from this kind of geological and refining situation, then comes the fact that the heavy rare earth elements tend to be used in highly specialized applications, right? So, for example, dysprosium is used in extremely high temperature alloys, right? So the kind of metal alloys that you need if you're building a rocket, something that's going to go into outer space, or unfortunately, if you're building a rocket that's going to power a missile as well, right? So those are both highly specialized applications. Whereas with cerium, for example, cerium is a lighter rare earth element. It's used all over the place. It's used from petroleum refining to acting as signal amplifier and fiber optic cables, but it also has a lovely pink color. And so it's used in decorative glassware and Christmas ornaments and tea sets and even rose-colored glasses and all of this.
I want to get to what we possibly can do to diversify our supplies of these rare earth elements away from China. So India, for example, is a member of the US-led Mineral Security Partnership since 2022. But before that, I want to take another detour and ask you about Nehru blocking the export of monazite sands out of India in early independence for India. So what is the context there, and what parallels to today can we find there?
Oh, right. Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think the historical moment, the Nehru administration and the dispute over monazite sands between India and the US, I think is instructive for our current moment, right? So specifically in our current moment, I'm referring to the kind of regression of international politics into different kind of ideological and political blocks, but also that is accompanied by record-breaking increases in military spending. So that's our current moment. With respect to Nehru and the monazite sands, like this issue, this account that I'm going to tell you, it occurred in the context of the global race to build the atomic bomb, right? And so the world was again fragmenting along different ideological and political fault lines. And India had restored its independence in 1947. And at that time, right in the context of the end of World War II and this race to build the bomb, nuclear weapons were really seen as guarantors of national sovereignty, right? And so you had all sorts of different movements, different political blocs calling for the end of nuclear weapons, other national leaders arguing very stridently that the only way they could defend themselves, especially in a post-colonial era, and maintain their independence was to have a nuclear weapon. And so in order to build a nuclear weapon, you have to have the raw materials in order to do that. And at the time, there was research not only in enriching and developing uranium-based nuclear weapons, but also in enriching and developing thorium-based nuclear weapons. And this is where monazite sands come in. So monazite sands had been exported from tropical beaches around the world, from India, Brazil, et cetera, to the global north for a host of applications, including weapons applications, really since the beginning of the 20th century. And so in the Indian Atomic Energy Act of 1948, thorium was explicitly named as a source of atomic energy, and that made it then an officially designated strategic mineral. And in order to shore up newly regained national sovereignty, this strategic mineral and others were blocked from export. Right. So this meant that thorium-rich monazite, which also contains rare earth elements, was no longer being exported to the West. In particular, this really disrupted the US's monazite supply. And this happened to coincide with a reorientation in US foreign policy with kind of attempting to curb the spread of communism, right? And so in that context, while all of this was happening, there was a terrible famine, of course, happening in India. Indian ambassadors in Washington, D.C. were negotiating for food aid, for famine relief, and all of this. And a handful of prominent Republican senators continually held up food aid bills in U.S. Congress for various reasons. But then once news of the monazite export restriction broke, then some senators proposed a kind of quid pro quo. This is maybe sounding familiar with Trump's negotiations with Ukraine, right? The U.S. has grain, India has thorium-rich monazites. The U.S. should make a loan of grain to India for famine relief that India could repay in the form of monazite, right? And so 1950, 75 years ago, this issue was also playing out in international politics.
Wow, that's quite interesting. Julie, my concluding question to you is, what should private industry, governments do to reshore capability and build resilience to their mineral demands? So we want our mineral access to be resilient, but also that our practices are sustainable. So what really can be done?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think the greatest untapped opportunity is in recycling and reclamation. So rare earth elements at the end of their use end up as garbage, right? And so in scrapyards, in landfills, in areas where you have decommissioned military and shipping equipment, e-waste dumps, all of this, you have an accumulation of rare earth elements and other critical raw materials currently miscategorized as waste. And this waste problem is growing simultaneous to this growth in supply chain concerns. And that to me seems to be a very silly situation and a very obvious solution. Now, for a number of years, folks operating within the rare earth sector objected quite stridently to the viability of recycling as a potential replacement for opening new mines. But what that kind of overlooks is the fact that no one's proposing to do a one-to-one substitution between recycling and mining. What serious-minded folks are actually proposing is reducing the waste footprint, right? This is part of broader circular economy and sustainability efforts globally. It's much bigger than rare earth elements. And maybe a kind of collateral benefit to instituting a circular economy is that the supply of rare earth elements and other critical raw materials increases. That reduces the need to open new mines in different parts of the world. That does, of course, just speak to the raw material aspect of things. And one of the things we've been talking about throughout this conversation is the importance of the entire supply chain. Now, rare earth elements are used in a host of sectors: energy, military, scientific and medical instrumentation, consumer electronics, transportation, etc. And within each of those sectors, there are anywhere between dozens to thousands of specific applications for rare earth elements. And so what that means then is that building a diversified global supply chain requires, I would say, previously unprecedented discussion and decision-making in planning. What sectors do we intend to serve, right, by building these supply chains? And that brings us back to that dual-use question. Are we going to build these supply chains for renewable energy to mitigate climate change? Or are we going to build these supply chains to increase the lethality and devastation of weapons, right, that are wreaking havoc in many different parts of the world, right? So in that way, these rare earth supply questions are inseparable from the defining political questions of our age.
Thank you. I couldn't have come up with a better end to this podcast than that. Something for us all to think about. The presence of rare earths with radioactive elements, their varied use cases including defense applications, and their highly polluting effects means that they have been used as a political and strategic tool and will continue to remain so.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Julie. And thank you, Tannmay.
Thank you. Have a good day.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle at Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.